Hi guys, welcome to the Cambridge Creatives Q&A with Danny Ben-Moshe. I'm Hannah.
And I'm Ellie, and we are the founders of Cambridge Creatives. We are a student-run creative collective. We are curating a series of talks with world-renowned professionals in film, TV, and theatre. So please follow our Facebook page to find out more about future events. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, please type them in on the Q&A function, which is just down the center bottom there, and we will read them out for you. Do bear with us if there are any technical difficulties, and let us know in the chat if there are any problems hearing or seeing us. Enjoy the Q&A.
So just a quick introduction about Danny. He is an acclaimed documentary filmmaker and his work has been screened at film festivals across the world. He has written, produced and directed the documentary Shalom Bollywood, the untold story of Jews and India's Bollywood. Most recently, he has directed Outback Rabbis, which tells the story of Orthodox rabbis hitting the Aussie bush looking for lost Jews. We're really honoured to have this intrepid filmmaker speak. So my first question for you, Danny, is when did you know that you wanted to be a filmmaker or get involved with the creative industry?
Well, it's interesting. I made my first film when I was about 35, I think, something like that, give or take. And before that, I'd been an academic, working in the university sector and working public policy. So you'd think I kind of decided I wanted to be a filmmaker when I was sort of in my 30s or whatever. But I was moving a couple of films later, so probably into my late 30s, I was moving house and I picked up a box from a cupboard and the bottom of the box just collapsed and, you know, like things do. And out of it came a letter that in my naivety, I had written in my final year at university to the Israel's BBC equivalent with an idea for a documentary I wanted to make. Can you imagine, like, you're the head of that channel and you get some letter from some kind of student who doesn't know anything about anything in the UK saying, please let me make a film. But I had this idea for a documentary and I'd completely forgotten about that. And actually, when I read the letter, I was embarrassed at the letter of my naivety, but the idea was pretty good. It was like, oh yeah, I'd like to watch that film. And the only thing, I studied law in London, and the only thing I knew when I graduated university was I didn't want to be a lawyer. That was, apart from that, it was all wide open. And not knowing what to do, I applied for two sorts of jobs. I applied for managerial jobs in airlines because I thought I'd get free air travel, and I like traveling. That didn't kind of happen. And then the other jobs I applied for were in advertising agencies, but I didn't even muster an interview. I very quickly started working in public policy, which I loved, and then got into academia, which I loved. So no regrets about anything of that. But it's interesting because when I became a filmmaker, this question often came up and comes up. And obviously it had been there because the fact that I wanted to work in the creative way in advertising, and that I actually wrote, I had this documentary idea. And in fact, some of you are theatrical buffs. Probably the thing that I enjoyed the most of my university days, I was at SOAS at the University of London, was I wrote a play which was produced and put on at a student arts festival. And it was, you know, I really enjoyed the experience. And in hindsight, I should have, well, no, I don't have any regrets, but it was clear that there was something always there, even if I didn't really realize it at the time.
So did any of your sort of theatre or creative experience at university prepare you for being a filmmaker later on? Or was it more just sort of learning by doing on the job?
Yeah, it's often when I do a lot of Q&As, and particularly at the moment, you know, I'm doing like one or two of these a week because there are so many virtual events. And kind of there's this assumed question like, what film school did you go to? And I didn't go to film school. And in fact, I have a lot of kind of young aspiring filmmakers come to me and they say, oh, you know, I want to be a filmmaker. I don't know whether I should do a master's or a this or a that. And, you know, I always say, get industry experience, because there's two things. Is one, this industry, it's very much like anything in life, any sort of work, it's about networking, you know. If I think, oh, I need a camera operator or I need a script editor, who pops into my head? So it's being on people's radars. It's learning the trade, and I think there's nothing like the actual real experience of filmmaking. And I don't do anything technical. I mean, if you want a bit of equipment destroyed, just ask me to touch it, and I can guarantee that will happen in seconds. And what I know is I need a camera operator, I need an editor, I need my sound recordist, I need my color grader, etc., etc., etc. What I bring to the film is the concept, the vision, and ultimately, filmmaking, I find in many respects, is probably not that different to... I was a research professor, and, you know, trying to get, and before that I was working in public policy, trying to get to the heart of a story, doing the research. What's this about? Where could this go? What really matters here? Why would anyone care about this? Those elements are the same. And the other thing is, when you sit down with someone, if I was making a film about students in the UK interested in film, and I would have to ask them questions, in many respects, it was the same as doing social science research, which I did, or the policy work I did when I would sit down with politicians or journalists or whatever it would be. And in many respects, it's about, you know, when you're behind the camera and you want someone to tell that story, that you've got to, one, know what to ask, two, be able to have the relationship, the trust, and three, have the information. So it's not a million, you know, not a million miles apart. I think the other thing I realized once I became a filmmaker, and people were asking me these questions all the time, was I'd always, and this is the other thing I say to aspiring filmmakers, watch documentaries. And I realized that my whole life I'd watched documentaries, you know, and I would take myself off to film festivals to watch documentaries. When I was at school, I would sit in my room at home in Hampstead Garden suburb and watch BBC documentaries. And I think that is the most kind of, you know, well, there's no one thing, but really, you know, where you get ideas, inspiration, see different ways things can be done, although obviously everyone can and should find their own voice.
It sounds like you had a great foundation to start with, but how did your first film come about, and how did you actually sort of get your foot in the door in the industry?
Yeah, that is one of the toughest things, although I should say, even once you get established as a filmmaker and you make some big award-winning film, the first time that happened to me, I made my first film in 2005, and in 2014 I made my, I think it was my fifth or sixth film, I can't remember, and it won the Walkley Award, which is like the Oscar equivalent in Australia, right? So it's very, you know, it's kind of qualified Oscar, but it's a big deal in Australia. And I thought, hey, I've made it now. I can go and make whatever I want. And then I've got this idea for the film, and I'd go back to the broadcasters and I'd knock on doors. And it was still, you know, no, that's not going to really work for us now. Or, oh, we're looking for these types of stories, or do come back to us if you've got something like that. So it's never easy. But the first one is of course very hard and massively important, because, you know, for aspiring filmmakers, if a broadcaster is going to invest in you, one, they're going to be investing money, and a lot of money. So they want to know it's not going to go down the drain. And I've I've sometimes been brought in for like sort of rescue surgery and stuff like that, where films get made, but they're just, you know, they're just a mess basically, and they need to be salvaged. This happens kind of quite often, and experienced filmmakers too, because sometimes stories, they're just so hard to put together. And the other thing is that, so what was your question again? How did I make my first one? Yeah. So that first one, you need that first one because it's a calling card. You know, I've made something. So at least the broadcasters have got something to see and take you seriously. And that's any way you can find to do that, you need to do. And I was very fortunate, actually. I was director of a research institute at Victoria University here in Melbourne. And we wanted to find new and innovative ways to disseminate our research, as opposed to a boring, like 500-page reports that only the synopsis of which will be read. And so we thought, why can't we make like some little films, you know, 3-minute little films, stick them on our website, share them to the stakeholders, all that kind of stuff. And it just so happened that a producer, life is so serendipitous, a producer in my institute, professor in my institute, his brother, he said, oh, my brother's a filmmaker, go and talk to him. And this kind of goes full circle with your question of when do you know you wanted to be a filmmaker. So I went to see him as the director of an academic research institute. And I said, I've got this, want to make these reports and we'd like sort of 3-minute films. How do we do that? How much will it cost? Blah, blah, blah. We had that conversation. And I said to him, oh, by the way, so you make documentaries? And he went, yeah. I go, so I've got a few ideas for documentaries. So he said, which as a documentary filmmaker, you know what's coming next. I now know that. So he said, so what are your ideas? And I reeled off half a dozen ideas. And one of them, he said, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. And cutting a long story short, that proved to be my first film. And I was very fortunate because I co-produced and co-directed that. And I did a one-on-one filmmaking, learning with him as I went. But he also knew, this was a film called The Buchenwald Ball, which is about a group of Holocaust survivors from the Buchenwald camp who were all kid survivors, child survivors. And it's a very unique group because they lost their parents. They were all kids when they were liberated. And every year they celebrated the anniversary of their liberation, which they deemed their common birthday. So these 50 guys, and they were all guys, had a common birthday, and they celebrated their birthday with a ball, a dance. So it was this story about dancing Holocaust survivors, liberation, the embrace of life. And he realized that I had the access to that community. Access is a massively important word in documentary filmmaking. I was able to establish the trust with that community. So when I sat down for what was the first interview I ever did as a documentary filmmaker, and I had these questions, it was no really different to me as an academic researcher or as a political researcher. And I just had him to guide me to say, let them give you their first answer and don't say anything in response, because it's always the second answer that's more interesting. So there are a few kind of tricks on the trade. So life is this weird kind of course. And that's how, and then when I made that film, which was a primetime, very popular documentary in Australia, I was like kind of hooked. I was like, oh, give me more drugs, right? And I had to, I say that word, and it felt like that. I need to make another film. And here I got close to getting, basically now I only make commissioned films, which is you take a film to the marketplace. It's a film industry, right? Don't forget that word. I mean, the creative side, yes, but industry. Took it to the marketplace, thought we would get finance for films, basically didn't. And I was going to make this film with this same filmmaker person. And he was an experienced filmmaker, and he said, look, there's no money for it. I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna do it. And I basically, one person had seen my Buchenwald film, really liked it, and felt he wanted to encourage new films. And I said to him, listen, can you give me $10,000 and I'm just going to make this film, which if I got from a production properly commissioned thing, it would have been $300,000. So I just did that. I met at a masterclass, a film student, an editor, and I said to her, listen, I want to make this film. I got 10K to shoot the film. I got no money to edit it. You edit it, and whatever I sell it for, you get half the money. And she said, okay. And I made my second film. So then I had 2 calling cards. But I think one of the things I've learned is, you know, and you're a creative group, there's a difference between the creative side and the business side. And it is very different. And I suppose because I'd been in university management and stuff like that, I had a sort of little bit of the kind of contracting and budgeting and all those sort of tedious things. But actually, even though I do produce, usually I co-produce because I know it's not my forte and it's a different skill set. I'm able to produce in terms of going to the marketplace, explaining to broadcasters why they've got to back my film. But then nitty gritty of budgets and timelines and all that tedious stuff is a different creature. And finding the right producer for filmmakers is very important. Or if you're a producer, finding the right directors and writers that you want to work with. So it is a very collaborative art. It's not like being a novelist, you know. I've got a good friend, in fact, my last film, China's Artful Dissident, was about a Chinese dissident. And he's an artist, painter, muralist, artist, street artist. And I go, oh, can't we swap? Like, I filmed him. My film is about him making his art. And he'll sit there on his computer, he'll draw his art for an hour, and then he'll get it printed up, and then he'll paste it up, and half a day and he's done, you know. A documentary is going to take from idea till it's seen by anyone in broadcast is realistically, for my sorts of work, is about 3 years kind of minimum. Now, you're not working on it full time. So it's a massive investment, and it's a very collaborative investment. And I've worked with filmmakers early on in my career who weren't open to collaboration. And the film suffered and their careers suffered as a result. So there's a couple of thoughts.
Thank you so much for that advice and information. How do you personally cope with the information or particularly sort of challenging storylines or struggles that you uncover in your documentaries? So for example, in the Buchenwald Ball, some of that content must have been very difficult to sort of learn about and deal with. How do you cope with that?
Look, I think different filmmakers have different interests that lead them to, you know, I've made, I don't know, about a dozen films, and a lot of them, majority of them are Jewish, but I think I've made 4 non-Jewish stories. My Chinese Dissident, I made a film about Carnaby Street, I made a film about jazz live music in Melbourne, and I think there's something else. Ultimately, a film takes so much of your energy and headspace. You have to be completely into that story. And I've learned that. I was pitched a story. It's a great story. It was about and I will answer your question. It was about a lawyer from Australia who wanted to be a top lawyer in the world. She got a job in a big firm in the City of London, big 6-figure salary, everything is great. She's realizing her dream. And then she's in Camden Market one day with a friend, and there's a sign up for boxing fitness classes. And her friend says, oh yeah, we should do this. And the lawyer says, I don't want to do boxing classes. And she goes, come on, I really want to do it. I don't want to do it alone. So they both go. It turns out the lawyer is pretty naturally good at this. Before you know it, she's in a ring having a fight. And before you know that, she's like 12 or so amateur knockouts later, she throws away her legal career at the age of 36 and decides to go for a world title fight. Along the way, her father is dying, and he says on his deathbed, there's something I've got to tell you. You're Jewish. I didn't want to tell you because of all this anti-Semitic history. So she takes on that identity. She has a Star of David on her shorts, and she gets sponsored by a Jewish sports organization called Maccabi in the UK. And it's like, this is unbelievable, right? So I contact her, I'm making this film, right? It would have been my third film, and I was just doing it on spec, because sometimes you've got to shoot or the story's gone. And then I was in Hackney at a boxing match, and I was by the ring, and the punches are going in and stuff like that, and there's blood and there's this. And afterwards we were back in the changing rooms, and all the boxers and the trainers and everyone swearing at each other. And I thought, I'm completely not into this. This is a great story, but it's just not me. And then you're going to have to sit there for week after week after week going through the rushes. So I think you know what stories you want to tell. Doesn't mean you won't get difficulties. But to give you another idea, I made two films. The film I mentioned before, Code of Silence, which won the big award in Australia, that was about the whistleblower on child sex abuse in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And that film was pitched to me about a year before I started making it. And the person said, do you want to make this film? And I said, I want to make a film about child sex abuse for. I mean, that is just a horrible, horrible subject. And even though there's obviously a film there and there's obviously market interest in it, it's not something I want to be exposed to. And then as I watched the story evolve over the course of the year, I realized, actually, it's not about abuse. It's about institutional cover-up. It's about blaming the victims. And so I made that film. In fact, it was so popular, we made a sequel, a second one for the ABC, which is obviously like the BBC. And without going into any details or anything, seeing any images or anything like that of child sex abuse, you didn't need to. So yeah, you have to be comfortable with your story. And I think you've got to be discerning as well about your audience. In the Buchenwald Ball, we put up I think there was one photo of a pile of bodies in the Buchenwald concentration camp, because we needed to show something, but that was not what the film was about. And you've also sometimes got to give your audience a bit of credit, like, you know, they know. But yeah, look, these things can be, you know, they can be difficult.
And how do you sort of go about making sure that you maintain the integrity of the people who you interview for your documentaries? You know, some people argue that documentaries make dancing monkeys out of their subjects. How do you make sure that it doesn't seem like a show?
Yeah, I think some documentaries do. I'm not so much, you know, there's within factual television, there are a lot of differences. The films I make are generally observational documentaries. So I always say, I've got a new film that I'm making for the BBC and at the moment, and just about to do a couple of interviews. It's a story that happens here, but it's global. Once we can travel, we will be traveling for it as well. And I was talking to two people who I'm arranging for my protagonist to go and see on camera. And I just say to him, what I say to everyone is kind of, imagine, they said, what do you want? One guy says to me, do you want me to put on a suit and tie? And I go, if someone said, hey, can I come and chat and you tell me what it was about, would you open the door wearing a suit and tie? Obviously not. So just be as you as it's possible to be. And ultimately, I want you to try and imagine the camera's not there. I want you to have the conversation with my protagonist that you had with me when I called you up, or when we caught up for a cup of coffee and we just chatted about this thing. And I find sometimes, you know, you might shoot a film over 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever months, and you end up using the last month, because by the time you've got to that point, people are natural. They're comfortable with you. Not only are they comfortable with the camera, they've kind of forgotten about the camera. And that's where you get the best film. And I think that's very much about the relationship between director and talent. You know, they're just talking to you as if you're part of this world they inhabit, and then if the truth comes out. Now, you can do that if you're shooting a film over months or even years, you know. My Chinese Artful Dissident film, I think we probably shot it over a couple of years. If you're making a more current affairs, timely piece and you're shooting it over a week, you need to get the monkeys to dance, because otherwise you're not going to get your content, you know. Whereas with the sorts of social interest, observational films I make, I might end up with, you know, 50 hours out of which I've got to extract one. You know, if you're shooting something over a matter of days, you're not even going to have that many hours to select your material from.
How would you describe your filmmaking style? It sounds like a very personal and close relationship you have with your sort of subjects who you interview. Overall, how would you describe the process of making documentaries?
It is about, I mean, for me, if you want to get a real story, I always say to people, sometimes, you know, people pitch stories to me all the time, and, you know, 99 times out of 100, it's either not of interest to me, it's not my shtick, it's not my subject, right? Or I'm busy with something else, or I say to them, I get there's a lot of people come, they think their stories are so incredibly interesting, and but they're not beyond a tiny, tiny little thing. Although any story can be interesting. There was a documentary out about, you know, a bumblebee farmer in somewhere in the Balkans, you know, that was, you know, a big international success. Of course, anything can be. But I think to me, the key, I always say to the people who are in my films, if people say they want to make a film, or I ask them to be in a film and they agree to be in a film, I say, if you really want to do this, you've got to be honest. You've got to be completely honest. You've got to bare your soul. And then we're going to get a real story, a story with heart, a story with meaning, a story that will touch people, and a story that's real. And in fact, going back to that boxer story, the people who were in that film weren't prepared to go there. So investing the time in the relationships and forming the relationships, you know, you can't just walk in and go, hi, I'm a filmmaker, talk to me. It just doesn't work like that. If you're interviewing someone for the news, yeah, you know. So I think that's really the approach I take to filmmaking. And that's why I think all my films have had special people, get to the heart of a story, are filled with emotion. I'm sure you could get technically better directors than me who have spent years in film school and know about every bit of light coming in through every frame or whatever. I very much subscribe to the mantra that content is king. You know, so there's a light above my head that's, you know, too bright. If I say something that, you know, matters. So yeah, that's really been my approach. And the other thing as well, I think that's probably distinct to my own films, as was pointed out to me in a conversation with a producer yesterday, is whatever the subject matter, I tend to find humor in the story. Even the film about child sex abuse, when we had the theatrical screening and there's kind of laughter, or even the Buchenwald Ball film, because they were funny characters, they're funny scenarios. And even my Chinese Dissident film, we had a screening in London at the Tate, and, you know, there was real laughter. Now there's really heavy, sad, difficult moments, But I think, one, that's just kind of me, I guess, and every director will bring something else. And I think that makes films accessible. And like with my Shalom Bollywood film, which is kind of quite different, it's not an observational, it's kind of telling this historical story in a linear fashion. I just kind of went a bit out there because I tried, that film took me over 10 years to make. And that would have been my second film. It ended up about my 11th because I had to make all, and I was trying to get the film financed, and people would say, "What's the film?" And I'd say, "It's the untold story of Jews in Indian cinema." And they'd say, "What's that?" And I'd say, "Well, when Indian cinema began, it was taboo for Hindu and Islamic women, right, to perform in public. So all female roles were played by men, like in Shakespearean style or Monty Python style. But the Jewish community was more liberal, more educated, blah, blah, blah. And the first superstar, right, of Indian cinema, unprecedented, unbeaten superstar till this day, was Jewish. The first Miss India was another star. Anyway, so they go, so I had broadcasters say to me, all right, well, it sounds interesting, but it's a bit too historical and not Jewish enough. Can you make it more Jewish? Okay. So I go away and I do all this work, scurry, you know, rewrite, recut, send them something, and then they go, could you make it a bit more Indian and a bit less nah? And then someone else would say, can you make it a bit more historical and a bit And in the end, after about 8 or whatever years, I went, you know what, you can all get stuffed, right? I'm just going to tell the story I want to tell. And people think I'm a Bollywood buff, which I'm not. Up until the time I made that documentary, I'd never watched a Bollywood film in my life. And I would not choose to watch a Bollywood film because it's not my thing. And I thought, this story, you know, Bollywood is so outrageous and outlandish, and the dancing and the color and the melodrama. I'm going to make a film that feels like that. I'm going to make a film that feels like a film. And so it's kind of structured in 3 acts. It has the animated curtains, etc., etc. So you've got to bring the right technique for the right story. So yeah.
Sounds like a really rewarding process, the whole production for Shalom Bollywood. What has been your favorite project so far, or your most rewarding project?
Different films, you know, different impacts in different ways. I know the film I made about my mum, my mother's lost children, you know, I've never got, which has also been made into a podcast called My Lost Family, which is on Audible. I would just get hundreds of unsolicited messages on Facebook and Twitter from people who would watch that, Q&As, and who would either pour out their hearts, or 2, I had no idea how many children were lost, as in taken, and families split up, not through wartime or anything else like that, but just through the whatever happens to families. And I did not do a Q&A of this film without 3 people at least, each Q&A coming up to me and said, your story, your mum's story is like my story. I had no idea. I thought I was just telling this one particular story. And I also had so many people approach me and write to me, like from everywhere, say, I've realized now that my family needs to talk. I need to tell my dad. I need to tell my daughter, you know? And so I think families were hopefully positively affected by that. So that's a great thing. I think probably in terms of international kind of impact, my Shalom Bollywood film just goes from festival to festival to event to event. You know, I did in the last week, I did a film festival screening. I did Chicago Jewish Film Festival screening for Shalom Bollywood, and I did a big screening in Delhi with the Q&A as well with the Indian International Center. I mean, people are fascinated, like, by that. It is this untold story. Then I think my Code of Silence film about child sex abuse, you know, had a massive impact in Australia. It was a massive primetime film. It it got so much traction that it was one factor, but definitely a factor that led the government to hold an inquiry, a royal commission into child sex abuse in religious institutions in Australia. It had a special screen. It didn't play anywhere else outside of Australia, so it didn't do big on the film festival circuit, didn't make it to the BBC. But for that film, that was the right impact, you know. It also screened before the Child Protection Committee of the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament. Probably the film I'm most satisfied with, though, in a way, is Outback Rabbis. Because it's really, like, people love my Mother's Lost Children documentary. I know they love it. I don't like it at all. It was like, no, that wasn't supposed to be like that. And it's not because I'm so close to the story, but it was just that I envisaged it in a different way. And, you know, Outback Rabbis is the only film I've made where I started off with a vision. I was told something in my very early filmmaking days, and I just take myself off to master classes and things like this. And there was a filmmaker who said, what you should do is write down your story as detailed as possible. And then as soon as you turn the camera on, rip up the piece of paper, right? Let the story take its course. And I did that. I did that with my second film, The End of the Rainbow, about this live music venue in Melbourne. And great stuff happened. Like, the guy at the heart of the film died, you know, and films take a course of their own. Even my boxer film, she was on the cusp of having her world title fight, and her friend said, you've got to get out for a night and just forget about all of that. And they went out to Hampstead Heath, I think, started having a joke game of rugby, and she broke her leg, right? Which is terrible, okay? But for a film, that's fantastic. When anything bad happens in real life, you go, oh my God, that's great, right, for the film. Anyway, but Outback Rabbis is the only film where I had this kind of vision, and that vision really was reflected in the end product. But maybe it was the easiest to make because it was a road trip movie. You know, we knew where we were going. There were some of the best moments in that film. Probably the two best moments were completely unplanned and unexpected. One is they're both scenarios that happen in pubs. And there were other things, you know, we thought would be great and they weren't. That happens. But that film is probably the closest to actual satisfaction I have in any of my films.
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant advice about ripping up your plan before you start. You're also a research fellow at Deakin University. Do you ever find that your research informs your documentaries, or even vice versa?
I'm not actually a research fellow at Deakin anymore. Basically, the way you got to understand, like, if I go like this with my computer, you'll be able to see my roof, right? And it's important as a filmmaker that, as well as telling stories, you can put a roof above your head, right? And so the way I worked, I was a full-time academic. I made 2 films on the side, The Book of My Ball, The End of the Rainbow. By the time I did that, I then became a part-time academic. I went 0.5, and I was making films and academia. And then about 6 years ago now, I think it was, whenever it was, I had to give up my academic job, because I knew if I was going to make it, I had to completely immerse myself. And, you know, I'd made the Code of Silence and Breaking the Silence about the sequel about child sex abuse here. And if I was going to finish Shalom Bollywood, if I was going to make this film about my mum, etc., I just had to throw myself in there. And so, and along the way, that meant I just gave up. I'm actually about to go back and be an adjunct prof at Monash University. But yes, there is a synergy between my research interests and what I make films about. And in fact, I'm hoping to write a book called Shalom Bollywood. So yes, definitely. Because I have a film colleague who says, each time you make a film, a documentary film, it's like doing a doctorate. You know, you're going to read everything, you're going to immerse yourself, you're going to interview everyone. My latest documentary, which we're still in a very early, we haven't even gone into production yet, is basically about a Holocaust survivor partisan. It's about a son who basically, after his dad passes away, his much older brother and much older niece, just talking casually about that time in the 1950s where dad was involved in a heated conversation in Yiddish about going off to Sydney to knock off a Nazi. And it was like, the son was like, what? And yeah, he was pretty, I mean, as a partisan, he was a no-nonsense, bullet in the back of head people. And there were, well, we know about, according to Australian government records, at least 4,000 Nazi war criminals here, many of them on the pay of the Australian government. But the point being, one, okay, I'm obviously interested in this sort of story. It's a human story, it's a family story, it's a son's quest, it's got all the things I like. But like in the last, I think, 3 weeks, I've read a book a week on the subject of revenge killings of Nazis after the war. One from the Klarsfelds in France, one a general book, and another one as well. So it's like, yeah, I could be, and I'm sitting there underlying things and highlighting things. So the academic stuff definitely feeds in, because some filmmakers like to get researchers to work on their films. I prefer to do my own research. It's just my sort of personality, and I've probably got the skill set because of my background that others don't.
It's really interesting. You've spoken about what your film, My Mother's Lost Children, means to you. What moved you to make that film, and what was it like releasing it, and what was the response from your family, I guess?
Okay, so for people who haven't watched it, firstly, shame on you all. But for people who haven't watched it, it's the story is, my mum was married, and without giving it away, if you are going to watch it, my mum was married. She got pregnant the first time she had sex when she was like 16. She had 2 kids. She was divorced by the time she was 18, single mum. The father came one day, took the kids. She never saw them again for many, many years. I'm the product of her second marriage, which happened several years later. Whenever I told people that story, and I've just obviously touched on it there because we made an 1.5 hour film. And one of the painful things, my producer and I often talk about this, we had our rough cut of this film was 1 hour, 52 minutes long. And that we were really loved. It was great. But we had an 1.5 hour slot we had to take it back to. And it was very, very painful. 22 minutes that had to be left on the cutting room floor. So everyone said, oh my God, that's an amazing story. Like eventually the families were connected. Like I didn't know my half siblings like my whole life basically. And when they emerged or re-emerged, everyone said, oh my God, you're a filmmaker. You've got to make that film. And I was like, I'm not, hello, you're my long lost half brother. You're my long lost half sister. I'm going to make a film about you. That's just, no, that wouldn't be right. And we got to know each other as half siblings over many years, to love each other as half siblings over many years. And then I was actually on holiday with my long lost half sister and my parents, with my mum. And my sister and I were walking along the beach, and she said, you know, so many people have gone through what I've gone through, looked for decades for their real mother. And if only they knew my story, that I found her, then it would give them hope. And I said, well, you know, there is a way we could tell that story and get that out there to the world. And she said, I love that. And I said, okay, I can't guarantee you I can tell this story, because just because I want to make it doesn't mean broadcasters will want to fund me to make it. But I said, I will only even attempt this if everyone who's caught up in the story agrees. One person says no. If there's 10 people, 9 say yes and 1 says no, I'm not doing it. And I thought there was no chance. I didn't think it doesn't matter who, but I thought there were at least 3 characters, actually 4 characters, who there was no way. And the enthusiasm by everyone, it was like completely surprised me. And it was like, well, all right then, read the signs. I better make this film. And I did. And everyone was basically I was surprised, but everyone was basically very happy with it, and I think because I allowed people, it was not my point of view. My job was just to facilitate everyone having their point of view in the film and being treated fairly, even if I did not necessarily feel fairly towards everyone. And for me, that was the most, when I had to interview the man who took my half siblings from my mum, which led to a massive trauma to my mother, I would say that was the most difficult interview I've ever done. And it's the only interview I've ever done where I've lost my composure. I went from being the filmmaker to the son. And we started, it's not in the film, but we had this shouting match. And and I just kind of crossed that line. But anyone who will see the film will probably understand as well that even filmmakers are human too.
Certainly. Just to come back to China's Artful Dissident that you spoke about earlier, obviously with the story about your mother, you had a lot of personal experience to make that story. How did you find out about the story for China's Artful Dissident, and what drew you to it? And also, how did you ensure that the artist's identity was protected while also sort of revealing enough to make it compelling?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so while I'm a tad parochial and make a lot of Jewish stories, I'm also interested in politics generally, and I did at SOAS, I did a double degree, and I studied actually Chinese law and politics at SOAS. So I've had this long-standing interest, we're talking a million years ago, right? But I've had this long-standing interest in China, and I live in Australia, and looking up to Asia and seeing what's going on with China is like really, it's the number one foreign policy issue in this country. And I think one with massive geopolitical implications. We're much closer to it here, the South China Sea, the Belt and Road in the Pacific, all of that kind of stuff. And Chinese investment, when we say Chinese, we're talking Communist Party investment in Australian infrastructure. And I'm thinking, this is just not a good thing for democracy. This is not a good thing for human rights. I would visit Hong Kong for whatever reason when I was traveling somewhere, and I would just kind of catch up with people, and I became aware of the issues of the abducted booksellers and stuff like that. And, my PhD was in political science, so I've got that kind of interest. And I guess all the story, if you're gonna throw 3 or so years of your life into something, you've got to really want to tell it, and you've got to think it matters to you and hopefully someone else in some way. And I was just watching all this China stuff literally in Australia every day. When you were going through Brexit in the UK, we were kind of going through, you open your newspaper every day and the lead story is China something. China and Australia, China in the Pacific, China, China, China. And, oh God, I hope I didn't sound like Trump. And so I finished my Outback Rabbis film. Was the most difficult shoot from a physical point of view, because if any of you have been to Australia and you go to the Outback, you realize how empty it is and how you have to drive for days and days and days to get nowhere. So we've been on the road basically for 4 weeks, and the distances, literally we would travel somewhere, get nowhere, sleep the night to travel another day just to get to a destination in the vain hope of a rabbi finding a Jew. And anyway, that all worked out. But when I got home at the end of that shoot, I was wiped, like physically wiped. And they got home on the Friday, and on the Saturday, I said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not talking to anyone. I'm not doing anything. I'm just going to sit on the couch, sleep, and read. And I opened the paper, and there was this article about this Chinese dissident artist who was a thorn in the side of the Communist Party. So I just read it. I'd actually had a couple of thoughts about films about street art, because I'm really interested in street art, just as a lay interest. And so that had kind of been, that street art thing had been in my headspace, just drifting around from time to time. And then I saw this, and I loved the cartoons. And a lot of it was about the Tiananmen Square massacre. Well, I was at university when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened in 1989, and it was like one of the definitive moments. It would be equivalent of your generation's Brexit or COVID, or I don't know. I mean, it was like massive. And so it was like, huh. And then I read he was based in Australia. And I thought, because to get a film financed in Australia, they want to have Australian content in the same way a British broadcaster wants to have British content. So I thought, no, that actually could work. And when I'd been on my Outback Rabbi shoot, I'd been slightly worried because I didn't have another film to make. And it was like, what? I'm out of ideas. It's all over, right? And normally I've kind of got like, the next 3 films are already in my head, and I didn't have another film. And I knew, okay, I've got another 6 months of post-production for Outback Rabbis, and then I'm going to have to give up my seating. I don't know what I'm going to be doing. I don't have another film. And got back from the Outback Rabbi shoot, opened that article, and it was like, this guy needs a film made about him. And getting to him was very difficult, for obvious reasons, because up until he met me, he had never met a journalist, film media person in person ever. He did a lot of homework about me before he agreed to meet with me. We had a lot of virtual communication without screens and stuff like that. And eventually, obviously, he spoke to a number of people who vouched for me. And one of the things I did is I actually sent him a film I made called Rewriting History, which is about the rewriting of the history of the Holocaust and the notion of double genocide in Lithuania, where my own family was from and experienced the Holocaust. And I think one of the things he understood was that these issues of human rights and justice and truth are something that really matters to me personally. I'm not just a filmmaker coming along going, hey, buddy Outtow, you're an interesting artist. Let's make a film about you. And I know it did. He watched that film and it made a difference in his decision to trust me with his story. And we both ended up being spied on by the Chinese, but hey. Literally knocking at my front door. Great. Chinese spies. But hey, there's the other thing is, if you've never pissed anybody off with anything, when I was making my child sex abuse film, I was surrounded by people from that community, furious. They called the police on me. The police came and they said, what's the issue? And I said, I don't know, I've got permits. They just wanted, of course, they want me to make a film exposing what's going on. When I was making my Lithuanian film, I had someone come up to me and take a photo straight, take a photo, and they said, we know what you look like now. And then they disappeared, right? So you have all of these things, but I kind of, again, another sort of mantra, I suppose, if you've never pissed anyone off, you've never done anything that matters, And if I was another person, I might be making reality TV shows about chefs who rebuild their houses and dance with stars and all those things that are popular. And I would be a much wealthier man, but they're just not the things that rock my boat.
Great last words. But we're about to have the Q&A section. So if you can all just write your questions on the Q&A function, which is just below, not the chat function, we'll read them out for you. But our last question for you is, do you have any TV or film recommendations to fill our lockdown summers?
Oh, oh, yes. The Patient. It's on Amazon. I'm pretty sure it's The Patient. It's an Israeli documentary about a Gazan Palestinian family. And it's incredible for capturing a true story as it unfolds. It's just true. It's just pure honesty and truth. And that's been one of the most, amazing films I've seen. It's quite old, I think 2011 or something like that. I'm really bad with questions like this. I should have prepped.
That's a good one.
Things that we've watched, but we've got a question here about, you touched on this briefly, but I think some more specific advice would be great. But someone asks if it's important to have both creative and business skills, and how can we go about gaining this experience, you know, if we don't have sort of research backgrounds or business backgrounds.
You know, if it's not rocket science. Making a film is really not rocket science. The technical stuff you need to be trained for. You know how to operate a camera, you know how to sound boom, you know how to operate editing software. I don't do anything like that. And I think one of the things to do is allow the people who have the skills, everyone brings their own strengths to a particular film. And I'm sure the person who's answering this question has an idea for a story. And often, you know, people make films about things that they know or that are acute to them, you know, and that's why they're the right filmmaker for it. And that in turn will be the first film that will start its own trajectory that will lead to the second. So I think it's just a matter from a research point of view. It's often just the world you know and you inhabit. And it's about speaking to people. Reading, you don't have to write a 100,000 word PhD dissertation, but you do have to get your head around the story. But you don't need all the information. Your job as the filmmaker is to get the people who have that information. You just need to know what you need to know, right? So like, for example, with my film at the moment, which is called Revenge, is I need my protagonist to find out how many Nazis there were in Australia and how many disappeared, potentially faced in extrajudicial circumstance. Right? I don't know that information, but I know the person who does. I just need to bring the two of them together, let them have the conversation. And then if it doesn't happen and the conversation needs directing, I would just come in and say, is it possible for you guys to discuss this subject? You know? So just think about all the different elements that you will need to be covered in the telling of the story. But ultimately, stories take a life of their own. My current film started off with what we thought was one murder by one guy, and it's opened up into something much bigger. And you know, that's often the case. It depends what type of documentary, you know, you want to make. Like, I watched the other night Becoming by Michelle Obama, or about Michelle Obama. You know, that was very kind of easy filmmaking in a way. I mean, nothing is easy. And my God, they've shot so many like locations and would have had so much information. But, you know, it was her story based on her book in these venues. That's easier to let the information come out. So it really just does depend on your story. As far as business, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Try and get yourself connected to a producer, you know, budgeting films, knowing how the film finance process is very complex. Often you will know when you see a film that when you watch the credit roll, which platforms like Netflix never let you do because they're always trying to hook you into the next like thing before you even have a chance to the credit roll. People who have like given their lives to this film, they don't even get on the credit roll. You'll see several broadcasters and funding agencies and things like that, because it's like a puzzle putting together the finance plan for a film. So, but really, knock on doors. Just say, hey, I'd like to intern in a production company. I'd like to shadow a director. You know, if you don't make it happen, it's not going to happen, right? So you've just got to, there's no shortcut to it.
Our next question is quite specific, but where can we see your films whilst in lockdown? What platforms are they on? Oh
God, that's another thing I should have checked. Okay, I think if you go, Amazon. So Shalom Bollywood's on Amazon. Outback Rabbis is on Amazon. My Mother's Lost Children is it on the Jewish Film Festival?
It is. The UK Jewish Film website have it on, and we have I don't know how long we have an offer for, but there's a 50% off the rental price if you put CAMB 50 to get 50% off.
And China's Artful Dissident is not available in the UK at the moment. But if you go to my website, which is www, obviously, identity-films.com, there's a tab there, films, which lists all the films. And then it should list on each of those pages where they're watching. Do you have Doc Play in the UK? Is Doc Play in the UK?
Not sure.
I haven't heard of it.
Okay, if not, it's probably a good thing to check out if you can. Doc Play, it's a dedicated documentary channel, and I think a couple of my films are on there. But this is another thing. This is a perfectly good example, right? Some filmmakers go, right, I'm going to produce my film, I'm going to raise the finance, I'm going to make the film, then I'm going to distribute the film. Film distribution is its own world, right? So, like, I give my films to a distributor, different distributors for different films, and they have to place it in the market. So, for example, my Chinese film, which was made for the ABC in Australia, my distributor has sold it to NHK in Japan, SVT in Sweden. It's not available in the UK yet, but that's their job to do. It's a whole different, job. And sometimes people move, they go from being in distribution into production, etc., etc. But anyway, I think for Outback Rabbis, Shalom Bollywood, they are definitely on Amazon, and My Mother's Lost Children, through the UK Jewish Film Festival.
Perfect, thank you. I think that is unfortunately all we have time for, because we've gone slightly over our hour, but thank you so much, Danny, for your amazing answers and for giving us all your advice and your time. And thank you to everyone who joined this call and for asking such great questions. Sorry we didn't get around to asking all of them.
And thank you for the opportunity, and good on you for organising this and nurturing your creative souls. And if anyone has got I see there's like kind of 5 things under the Q&A and 2 on the chat. If anyone has a specific question, you can contact me through my website, or just email me, Twitter, Danny B_M, I think it is, or Facebook, whatever it is. I'll endeavour to get back to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And to everyone who's watching, please like our Facebook page for more updates. We have another Q&A with producer Charles Furneaux on Saturday, June 20th at 6:30 p.m. And thank you again, Danny. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. See you. Good luck with your lockdown. Bye.